Hi, I'm Tamara, and this is TELUS Talks with Tamara Taggart. Hi, everyone. My name is Tamara Taggart, and I am so happy to have Carey Newman with us here today. Carey is an artist, a master carver, and creator of the Witness Blanket, which we will be hearing all about today. I, as always, want to let you know I'm joining you from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory the Coast Salish peoples, the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam First Nations, and I'm very grateful to be raising my family here. Carey, how are you? It's good to see you.
I'm very well today. It's beautiful outside, and yeah, it's great to meet you as well.
It's really good to see you because I feel like I know you a little bit now because I've been watching some stuff that you have done and been reading about you. And I really want to have a conversation so that people, we've been hearing about residential schools so much. And you have a project. I believe it was in 2014 that this project was completed, right?
That's correct.
The Witness Blanket. So can you maybe start by just telling us what is the Witness Blanket?
Sure. The Witness Blanket is an art installation made up of objects, documents, all sorts of material gathered from residential schools, churches, government buildings, and communities across Canada. And it was my response to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's call for commemoration initiatives. And the kind of idea behind it was to gather truth, was to collect these pieces and in some way through those, there's all kinds of things on there, right? There's everything from bricks and tile to hockey skates and piano keys and braids of hair. And the idea was that these objects are witnesses to history. And being the son of a residential school survivor and an artist, I was looking for an artistic response that could help to share the truth about that history.
You visited a lot of communities. You traveled a lot of kilometers. And you met a lot of people. Yeah, you met a lot of people.
As a team, it was, I think we have stats somewhere, and it was like 100,000 kilometers and 10,000
I have
people.
200,000 here. I have 200,000.
That's returned.
Yeah, exactly.
But I should be really clear that was as a team, because it did take a team to gather all these objects. And when I set out on the journey, I thought I was going to get to travel all those places. But the reality was, with the project of the scale and the timelines, because it was really, really tight timeline, I ended up spending most of my time as an administrator here in my home. Right. and then building it, right? That was so I've gotten to travel a lot of the places since, because the blanket went on tour. But in the actual gathering, I feel like that's one of the things that I wished that I could have done more of.
Let's talk about when you were a young boy and growing up and hearing stories from your father. Did you always know about residential schools?
I don't think I can remember exactly how old I was when I learned about them, but it feels like it was always something that I'd heard. I think probably when I was young, I didn't know what it meant. Right? Like you hear these things and you think, oh, it's, a school where people live. But as a 5, 6, 8, 10-year-old, you don't necessarily know what that means. And eventually it became it came into my consciousness, right? I started to learn more and understand more about the kinds of things that happen at residential school. But with that said, my dad was really, really protective about what he told me and my sisters. He didn't share a lot of the deeper, darker trauma. We heard stories about food, and we knew he didn't like certain kinds of food because he had to have it so often at residential school. We heard a story about stolen wine that makes it into the documentary, and it kind of formed my own contribution to the blanket itself. And eventually we heard the story about when his first day and when he had his haircut. And so in a way, the witness blanket was me searching for some more information. My dad is still alive, and going through the process of making this with him around, it really transformed our relationship. It transformed my understanding of him as a person, and that equates into me having a better understanding of myself. So, yeah, it's so many different things. It's hard. It's always hard for me to kind of nail it down. But
yeah, well, how can you possibly? Yeah.
And when I think back to when I was a kid, I knew about it, but I didn't know everything. And then I slowly became more and more aware about what that meant.
So when we talk about truth and reconciliation, can you have reconciliation without truth?
Unequivocally, no. It's impossible. And I think that's one of the challenges that we're facing in this country right now around the phrase truth and reconciliation, because we had this big commission that did all this work to investigate and learn and share truth. And the witness blanket is a small part of that larger work. And then we move on to the conversation, like how are we going to move forward? And so many of us who've been paying close attention know that we're not done with truth yet. When we have politicians in this country who still diminish the experience, who defend the intent of residential schools, then we're still working on truth. And this past couple of months since the discoveries of unmarked graves in Kamloops, and since then in multiple other locations, we're seeing really how far we are from understanding the truth. Because I think that the reaction of this country to learning about those is an indication of how much more learning Canada has collectively to do.
When I look around sometimes and I hear people say, oh, they're just so tired of hearing about it all. In your opinion, why is it so difficult for some people to understand the truth of the history of this country?
I think that it comes down to a couple of things. I think one of the things is that the narrative that Canada or people in Canada have built of this country is one of sort of a humble exceptionalism, where Canadians are polite, we're friendly and welcoming to multicultural, to multiple cultures around the world, and progressive, right? Like when you travel this world and you meet people from other places, that's the Canada they've heard about, because that's the Canada that we in this country have taught to ourselves. And when you start to hear about atrocity, when you start to hear about like the word genocide attached to this place that you've grown up feeling so proud of, then it sort of starts to tear apart at the fibers of the Canadian identity. And I think it causes kind of an emotional dissonance where, you love a place, and in a lot of respects, a lot of those things are true, right? There are many people who move to this country for a better life from other places where there's war, or where there's a far greater or more overt kind of intolerance. My family, my wife moved here from Taiwan with her family when she was 3, and they came here for a better life. So that's a truth, right? On the other hand, Indigenous people have been displaced from land, been pushed over onto reserves, and we have all of these different colonial projects that have happened that we're learning about that haven't been taught in schools, that haven't been part of the identity of what it means to be Canadian. And I think that's part of why it's difficult for people. Then I think there's also the kind of status quo comfortable, right? And when I hear that, what you said about like, oh, it's just so hard. I'm just shutting down. I'm just changing the channel. I've heard enough. I can't hear anymore. I think, wow, wouldn't it be nice if for a day or a week I could turn it off, right? Because when you're part of the subject, you can't turn it off. I actually heard an acquaintance say that during the George Floyd protests, that it was too much to hear all of the things that were going on, and that they just changed the channel. And I sat and thought, wow, imagine if I could change the channel. Imagine if George Floyd could change the channel. Imagine if residential school survivors could change the channel, but we can't. Because it's not something that you can choose to tune into. It's something that is all around us. So I encourage people not to, not to disengage.
Yeah. And I think that, I grew up here, went to school here, went to many different schools. I just happened to move around a lot as a kid. And I don't ever recall learning about residential schools. Now, my kids started learning in grade 3, I believe, grade 3 or 4. And they know more than I ever did about our history, the truth. And do you think that that's where we will learn, is by educating our youth? And do we have to wait another generation before we start seeing ourselves for who we really were / are, able to move forward?
For who we really want to be, maybe.
Yeah.
I think that there's an incredible amount of hope in the children of today. In working at schools, I did a totem project at my daughter's school over the last couple of years, and I go into her classroom, or have been going into her classroom on Orange Shirt Day to read about, age-appropriate stories about residential school. And children have a totally different way of processing this information, because that difficulty that we were just talking about around why it's so hard for so many people to face the truth, it isn't there as a barrier for them yet, right? And learning about it isn't traumatic or even emotional. Mostly it's about fairness and justice. Like when you're talking to a 9-year-old or an 8-year-old, they look at this as what's fair and what is just. And they see residential schools and they say, that's really unfair, right? When we as parents see it, we think, imagine if that was our child. And then we get our own emotions all wrapped up in it. And then it becomes, sometimes people center themselves, and that's when they disengage. other times, that emotion is what turns people to action. That's what I've sort of observed with the witness blanket, is it approaches it in a way that it brings up people's memories, engages them on a personal level. Mm-hmm. And a lot of different projects that have resulted from the witness blanket, I think, owe part of their existence to people moving toward action because they felt something.
I was watching a documentary about the witness blanket. I have been watching it in small bits because it is incredibly emotional to watch. Stanley Hunt was somebody who when he went into the school, he stood at the door. He said, he said something like, my story begins right here in this room. His memory of it is so moving and so hard to watch. I don't care who you are. It is unbelievable. Like, this is a man who lived this. How do you watch these stories unfold, right? With the witness blanket. And I'm not talking about you, and I'm not talking about me. I'm talking about the people who, need to understand the truth, right? That's where I run into this. Do we leave the people behind that don't believe the truth? Or do we need them? Because I think that it's a much happier road to reconciliation if Indigenous and non-Indigenous people can work together.
I don't think we can leave behind those who don't believe. But I don't think that we need them to continue to do the work, right? Because the reality is there are some people who will never agree, who will never believe. So I think that the work happens on multiple levels. Sometimes it's watching segments of a documentary in portions that you can digest. Sometimes it's getting out and talking about Orange Shirt Day, or helping to ensure that the communities have what they need to confront, to deal with, to figure out what to do with all these graves that are being uncovered. Sometimes it's taking on that work of confronting others who are denying the reality of it, but it happens. I think it happens in bits and parts, and it involves as many of us as possible. And as that momentum continues to build and grow, that's where change, like transformational change, occurs. And I guess that's what motivates me as an artist, right?
Yeah.
I think that there's so many things in this world that you can kind of become overwhelmed. But if I focus on art and injustice and the ways in which the work I make can help to share truth, to share a different perspective, then I can wake up each day feeling energized and motivated, and I think importantly hopeful, because you see like one person here, one person there who respond in the way that you need people to respond to make change happen.
Mm. I want to talk a little bit more about the witness blanket and how people can see it and what people can do to understand more. But before we do that, we like to thank our guests for spending time with us. And our way of doing that is to give back. And we asked our guests to pick a nonprofit in Canada. You chose the Binners. We will be giving them $500 in your name on your behalf to support them. But can you it's a Vancouver-based group. Can you maybe explain why you chose the Binners?
Sure. It's because maybe first and foremost, because my sister-in-law Iris works there.
Well, that's a good reason, but I know there's more.
The work that they do is frontline work that is zero barrier. They help people who need help. And they provide a service for society, for companies, for apartment buildings. And my understanding of the Binners Project, it empowers people to take part in whatever capacity they currently have.
Well, I'm glad that we can give them $500 on your behalf. So thank you for choosing the Binners, Carey. Do you think that, I mean, I hate to generalize, is trauma understood? I think that, a lot of us carry trauma that we're not even aware of. But when we're talking about the trauma that comes from residential schools, when I, talk about this with people, I get the sense that some people just don't understand what trauma is.
I describe what we see today as concentric trauma. You've probably heard it described as intergenerational trauma. And the reason I say concentric is because I'd like to try to locate the trauma with the source of harm rather than with the generation before. But it does ripple through generations. And it results in a lot of the things that we see in this world, the disparity between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people in this country. It dates back to the foundation of Canada. When my mother's family moved here from England, Ireland, and Scotland in the early 1900s, they came because they were promised free land. And all they had to do was farm it. But that land was taken from Indigenous people. And so I can look at my own life and my own family and those two histories, and I can see the way that moment in Canadian history has led to the disparity we see. Because on one half of my family, we have people who mostly have post-secondary education, mostly have home ownership. And on the other side, far fewer with post-secondary, very few who own homes. And that's a story of intergenerational wealth and how owning property is a huge part of setting your future generations up for success within the society we've built. The same is true for trauma, but in an even more stark way, because the trauma of colonialism is not over. We still see a disproportionate number of children, Indigenous children, taken, and that results back to residential schools, traces back to residential schools. We still see overrepresentation of Indigenous people in prisons, and that connects into this trauma. And I think when I think of trauma, and I think of the different kinds of trauma that people face, I think you're right. I don't think that those who haven't really felt it in their lives understand what it means, because you can have had a terrible experience in your life and you can think it's behind you and feel like you've moved on, and then one day you can wake up and something has happened that triggers that trauma and you're right back there in the exact same place, and you have to fight through it all over again. You have to confront it all over again. Now imagine that the triggers for the trauma exist all around you all the time in the form of pipeline protests, in the form of hydro dam projects, in the form of children being taken from your community and put into the social welfare system. You can't heal from a trauma that's ongoing. And I think that so often when we think about trauma and the way that it surfaces through addiction, through different kinds of behaviors, we put the onus on the individual to heal themselves. And we encourage them to go to treatment. But unless we also do the work of taking away the causes of the trauma to begin with, like clean water on reserves, right? Then we continue to go through the cycle because the trauma is not finished. It's not all stuff that happened back in the 1800s or the early 1900s. The last residential school in this country closed in the 90s. And with all of those other things I've just mentioned, and there are more. I mean, there's also all kinds of racism. And those are the things that keep the trauma on the surface for so many people and make it so difficult to move on.
Is it important that we recognize the word or say the word genocide? Yes.
I've seen a shift happen from when the Truth and Reconciliation Commission said cultural genocide to when the MMIWG report said genocide, and the Prime Minister of this country accepted the findings of the report, to now where we're finding or uncovering all these graves, and the international community is looking at Canada and saying that was genocide. I think that part of the problem is that not everybody understands the term genocide. A lot of people associate it with the Holocaust, with Rwanda, with, murder. Not everybody has read the definition of the man who coined the phrase, and how one of them is removing children. One of them is taking away culture. These are all different parts of genocide, and it's about removing cultural identity. And you can do that through slaughter, but you can also do it through this humble way that Canadians do things, and politely take away land and children, and say that it's to educate them or re-educate them and to integrate them into this new society. But it doesn't make it any less terrible that the intention is to change a culture, to erase a culture. I've done some work with the Canadian Museum for Human Rights in presenting about residential schools, about colonialism as genocide outside of Canada. And honestly, I think that might be the key to waking up Canadians, because our reputation is really valuable to us. And when other people in other countries start to use the word, and they have, because there's more and more evidence of the kind that people think of as genocide with these graves. And I think that's what it will take. In the same way that we're not going to get everybody to agree that residential schools were terrible, we're not going to get everybody to agree to say the word genocide. But in reckoning with the identity of Canada, we need to acknowledge it collectively. And we need to take steps to change the way we think about these lands. When we're talking about reconciliation, there's the relationship with each other, but there's also the relationship with these lands. And, in BC, we're down to 3% of old growth ecosystems remaining. We can't keep cutting things down and digging things up at the rate we have. We just went through this huge heat dome that was tragic in its consequence for places like Lytton, for people who were unprepared for that level of heat. And these are indications of the consequences of not taking care of the earth. And that might feel like, or seem like, or sound like a departure from the conversation about reconciliation. But Indigenous people lived here for at least 18,000 years on this coast. There's village sites that date that far back. And we've gone from 99% of the old growth ecosystems to 3% in the last 150 years. So that's happened through industrialization. That's happened because I think of the way that capitalism operates. And if we reset our relationship with the land and think of that as being primary in its importance to human existence, then I think that that's a big part of what reconciliation needs to be. We have a word for it in Kwakwala, which is the language of my dad's dad, my grandfather. And the word is Awitnakyola. And it means to live in good relations with the land, air, water, spirit world, and everything in them. And I think what would happen if you added into that technology, if industrialization lived in good relationship with everything around it, then we would be empowering humanity without the destruction of the earth.
So for people listening, how can they see or experience the witness blanket?
Well, we're working on a few different new ways, but currently there is a touring exhibit that's a replica of the blanket that I believe is in Nanaimo right now. And I think it's booked to travel until 2026. There's the original blanket, which is on display at the Canadian Museum for Human Rights in Winnipeg, as part of an exhibit called Preserving a Legacy, where we're working with the Canadian Conservation Institute to restore the blanket because it was doing the traveling for 4.5 years, and it took a bit of a toll. There's the documentary you mentioned, which is called Picking Up the Pieces, The Making of the Witness Blanket, which is available through the museum website, the Canadian Museum for Human Rights website. And we're working on a digital exhibit called the Digital Witness Blanket, as well as a virtual reality project. And we're hoping to be able to add into that an augmented reality project that makes it so that you can see some of the things that are available on those digital platforms when you stand in front of the blanket, just sort of through your own device. Lastly, there's a book called Picking Up the Pieces, Residential School Memories, and the Making of the Witness Blanket, which I co-authored with my friend Christy Hudson. And it's available through Orca Publishers, Orca
Awesome.
Book Publishers.
And the website is witnessblanket.ca.
That's correct, yeah.
What is your hope with the witness blanket? That it continues to travel and educate?
Yeah. There was a time when I thought that the work of the witness blanket would be done when I finished making it. That was in 2014. And here we are 7 years later. And I think that it's potentially more important and more relevant today than it was then. But it's also grown, and it's grown through the actions of so many other people who've come forward and said, what can we do? How can we help? It's grown through partnerships. And so I want it to continue to be part of the truth, because once we get a real handle on the truth, then we can start with the other things, like the reconciliation part. And that's what I do. That's what I'm going to continue to do with my artwork and my studies and the things that I talk about when I have an opportunity to have a conversation with people like you. I want it to be there.
Yeah, it is. To say it's beautiful, meaning it's filled with pain, but it's beautiful. I mean, I recommend that everybody watch the documentary, Picking Up the Pieces. I just think it should be a mandatory watch. It's really important. Thank you for taking the time to have this conversation and to, I wish I could talk to you longer. You were on Twitter at Blue Raven Art, right?
Yes.
Are you on Instagram too?
I'm on Instagram under the same.
Okay,
Blue
perfect. Carey, thank you so much. Carey Newman.
Gilakasla.
Thanks for listening to another episode of TELUS Talks with Tamara Taggart. Be sure to subscribe so you can join us every Tuesday for another conversation. You can also check out our website, telus.com/podcast, and subscribe to our YouTube channel at TELUS Talks.